And thanks to thank you, Tina, and thanks to everyone attending, and particularly thanks to Richard, who made time in his busy agenda to be with us today. Uh, I've known Richard for more than a decade now, I think. He wears a couple of hats. He's both a think tanker and academic. So he's a program director at the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, which is based in Bratislava and Prague. And he's also assistant professor at the Palacký University in Olomouc in the Czech Republic, where he actually runs quite a lot of projects, large-scale international and European projects. One of the most impactful projects he does, and he's probably now best known because of it, is the surveys on perceptions on China in Europe and beyond. So he has quite an international career. He's been educated in Europe, spent time in Canada, also in Greater China, so both in mainland China and in Taiwan. He spent time in Brussels as well, and published his book on Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, which Springer a few years ago. Why I invited him to speak to us? Because through his work on studying the public perceptions of China, he has quite a lot of data, including data on intergenerational differences in the perceptions on China. But I also personally have, whenever I talk to Richard, we always come up with ideas for research and identify gaps in the literature. And one of the most recent things that we've discussed was how there is not enough systematic research on youth perceptions on China, especially in light of some newer trends in China's official soft power projection, but in general, a lot of these things happen spontaneously internationally. So let's say Gen Z in the West has been having quite a different understanding of China compared to older generations. And this matters in an age of geopolitical uncertainty. We hear quite a lot about US-China rivalry, Europe-China rivalry, and maybe his data and his insights on especially youth perceptions in China can be very useful at this moment. Before I give him the floor, actually, I wanted to share a video with everyone just to warm you up. And a personal note, so I've been dealing with China for a long time, but at some point I realized that okay, people who have been to China, they have particular view of China, they know the nuances and all, but outside of China there was always very stiff view, like this very far away authoritarian place, very distant, very rigid. But I think about 10 years ago, at least in my subjective perception, the perception started to change. And part of the change was, at least for me, was the rise of popular Chinese movies and music. And I'm going to share a snippet from a rap video that at the time went viral. Maybe some of you know it. Yeah, so just to warm up before I give the floor to Richard.
My chance new girl watch me China. We play ping pong ball made in China. Get bitch metal says pay made in China. It had brother black car made in China. She said that she didn't love me. She said that she didn't love me. She said that she didn't love me. She lied, she lied. She all made it in China. She all made it in China. She all made it in China. She lied, she lied. I
can share the link later if anyone wants to hear more of the song and the performers. Anyway, on that note, I give now the floor to Richard, and I look forward to later engaging in discussion with him, and I encourage also everyone to take notes, ask questions, and so on. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Anastas. This is, I think, the first time I'm gonna speak after a rap video introduction, so that was a good start. And thanks a lot, Anastas, for invitation and in a way for pushing me to focus on this topic in the presentation. As you mentioned, my research has been in recent years focused on the perceptions of China and what drives these perceptions, and something which people would call soft power. I prefer to talk about attraction. But one thing indeed which I haven't looked so much is this age, the role of age. And so for preparation for this talk, I kind of looked a bit into these issues. So I'm going to share some findings with you. And I understand we have up to about 1 hour. So my plan is that I prepared slides because when we discuss public opinion surveys, I think it's quite useful to see the charts and maps and so on, because otherwise it would be difficult to maybe kind of catch all the nuances which the data show. So I'm gonna show you actually quite some findings. So I'm gonna go a bit faster. And I'm definitely looking forward to discussion. So I'm kind of going to go a bit faster, and then in your questions, you can kind of ask more specifically, so we zoom on something. And I'm going to start with a bit broader things, and then I will kind of progressively move towards, towards the issue of the age. And also, Anastas wanted to ask me to maybe mention a little bit about the Southeast Europe. So that's the plan. So let me share my screen, and let's go for it. So a little bit about the background. At Palacký University, we had a big kind of EU project. And as part of this project, we managed to survey 56 countries or territories worldwide. So that's quite a lot. And in a way, we could only do this because of COVID. So we couldn't travel. So we invested a lot of travel money into the surveys. And you see that we had 5-6 waves of surveys which started in 2020. Most of the countries we surveyed in 2022, and then last year we also surveyed 4 countries of Central Europe again. The way how we did it was basically we hired a professional survey agency which collected the data for us. And without getting in details, but we can later if you want, we kind of followed sort of golden standards of online surveying. And in a way, our data is quite unique because it's one of the broadest. So it includes 56 countries, territories. But what is perhaps even more important is that it's very detailed. So we have actually dozens of different questions about differences in China. So it's not that we only ask about how people perceive China, but we ask a lot of specific things, which other surveys such as Pew and others, I'm also going to show you others, they often don't have that. So that's why ours is quite unique. If you're interested in a project, we published more than 100 publications so far, more than 10 academic articles. So all of those are on the first link. And then, for instance, as Anastas said, some of that we also made into more policy type of publications or even trackers. So there are some interactive trackers. So feel free to check these, or you can, of course, get in touch with me. I'm always happy to engage with people. So starting with some broad findings. So on this chart, you also see the countries we surveyed. You don't see China here because this chart visualizes how countries perceive China. The darker the color, more favorable opinion. So you see that, for instance, Pakistan is the most positive country, followed by countries such as Bangladesh, some of the Southeast Asian, Russia, Kazakhstan. When it comes to most of the global south, they would be kind of neutral or actually slightly positive. And then kind of the Western Europe, North America, Japan, South Korea are negative. Actually, South Korea was the most negative country. So the chart which I showed previously shows our data from about 4 years ago. This chart is from the most recent data by NIRA organization. And in a way, I'm showing this to show that kind of the image of China globally hasn't changed that much over the previous 4+ years. So South Korea still the most negative, Pakistan still the most positive, and basically what I said kind of still applies today. What was interesting for us, it still is how the image of China compares with the image of the US. And then again, here you're looking at our findings, and we found that in most of the countries worldwide, the US had in 2022 more positive image than China. An exception again was Pakistan, and then to some extent Bangladesh, Russia, Kazakhstan, actually Slovakia, which may be interesting, but Slovakia has traditionally, or many people in Slovakia has traditionally had a very negative image of the US. But kind of the short finding here is that the US had much more positive image globally than China. And that changed a lot since last year. And so this again is the finding from NIRA, which is most recent, done last year, the first half of the 2025. And you see that actually now most of the world has more positive image of China rather than the US. So basically only, so to say, traditional allies of the US would have more positive image of the US. So Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, India, Ukraine, Poland, UK, Brazil, and that's about it. Right, most of the world would now have more positive image of China, not because their image of China would be very positive, but because the image of the US got more negative. You kind of see it over here. This is again the NIRA data. So you see how the image of US, the blue line, dropped globally since last year. And basically the image of China didn't change that much, although it's been kind of steadily growing over the previous years. But it's really the image of the US which changed here. This one shows specifically findings in Europe. So, I mean, I understand we're going to talk mostly about Europe, maybe Central Europe, Southeast Europe. So I also showed here the data for Europe, which Europe is actually pretty much the only region worldwide which has predominantly negative image of China. But you also see that the image of the US got even worse. So that's why the image of China is less negative, or you could say more positive, but it's really less negative. Let me show you some of the findings from our survey, because that will also help us understand why these shifts happened, and also help us understand the differences in terms of age groups and so on. So you're looking now at regression analysis of our data, and basically we tried to identify why people globally have certain images of China. And the short answer is that they form their image of China based on how they perceive China's foreign policy. And so the more positively they see China foreign policy, the more positively they see China. But of course, also the more negatively they see China's foreign policy, the more negatively they see China, right? So, but really the China's foreign policy is the number one factor, driving force, followed by China's quality of life, which is very interesting and important because this is not discussed so often, but really especially outside of the developed world, so to say, for many people in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere, when they think of China, they think of a developing country which managed to develop quite successfully, has skyscrapers, all sort of things. And in a way, they are impressed with this sort of thing. They do not think so immediately about political values and so on. I'm going to show you also next slide. So this is a similar chart, but focusing on the countries in China's neighborhood. Again, China's foreign policy is the most important thing for them, which makes sense because they border China. But then if you look at the countries in Global South, as I said, the quality of life in China is the most important driving force for them. But for the people in Europe and North America, China's political values are the more important driving force. So again, when people in Europe think about China, that's what we found. The first thing they think is that China is an authoritarian country. They don't like that, and that is driving their image of China. Of course, I'm talking now about the average findings. There are differences about different socio-demographic groups. We're going to talk about that also in terms of the age. But I also wanted to show you a few more things from our survey. And here we asked respondents kind of how they perceive different things in relation to China, so trade with China, Chinese investments, and so on. And kind of what we found is that, of course, people make differences. So maybe they don't like China's influence on democracy or China's military power, but they actually like Chinese technology. They see positively trade with China and so on. Especially Chinese technology has been found to be perceived very positively even in Europe, which is interesting finding. And I think that goes also in the direction of our discussion about why young people have maybe somewhat different image of China. And then, another reason, another kind of chart which looks similar but visualizes something a little different is what kind of foreign policy priority people in Europe here would suggest. And you see that actually in most European countries, they kind of ask their government to cooperate with China on global issues such as climate change, epidemics, and so on, which I think is important. And I think it also explains a bit why that image of the US went down so much this year and why that also improved the image of China a little bit. Because not only, of course, with the Trump foreign policy, in a way, this preference for some kind of global cooperation seems kind of very difficult to achieve with the US. But with all the difficulties, China just, at least for many people, seems like an easier partner to deal with, really. I'm not saying that that's what I think, but I'm saying that's what the data shows. Okay, we're getting to the age. And these are, again, the findings from NIRA, so some of the most recent survey findings we have. And we see that in most countries, young people, so here they mean by these people under 35, so I'm not part of that already. But we see that young people would tend to have more positive or at least less negative image of China. And so especially in the countries here, so you see Japan, for instance, there is quite a big difference in Japan that younger Japanese have less negative image of China. And that definitely applies to the US, Germany, Netherlands, Australia, India. Interestingly, it doesn't apply to South Korea. Which I would explain that the South Korean young people would tend to be more nationalistic and kind of actually South Korean image of China has got quite negative in recent years. But anyway, it's interesting to notice that this doesn't apply to South Korea, it doesn't apply to Singapore or Malaysia and so on. Over here, we have the similar finding from Pew Research, also the most recent from 2025. And we basically see that in most countries you're looking at, young people have better image of China. Interestingly, this doesn't apply to Hungary. Why? And my interpretation would be, and that also goes to what I'm going to say shortly about Central Europe, and perhaps a lot of that would apply to Southeastern Europe. In Hungary, as everywhere, young people tend to be more liberal. And in Hungary, more liberal means more pro-Western. And also given, of course, this survey was taken last year with Orbán still in power, more liberal, more pro-Western meant kind of more against China because of Orbán's policy towards China, right? So you see that Hungary is one exception here where young people actually don't seem to have, don't have better image of China, but in other countries they do. This is another survey from Politico. You see the similar thing, that young people have more positive view of China. But also, we should not exaggerate this, because you see that still we talking in Germany about, I don't know, 17% of young people kind of having more positive view. So that's not that young people are pro-China. It's really more accurate to say they are less negative, right? This is a screenshot from a recent article which I published based on our survey, and I looked at the 5 ICE countries, so kind of the English-speaking countries. And again, we found that young people were more positive towards China, and we were also trying to understand why that is the case. And again, one reason is that young people tend to be more liberal. But also there is some kind of socioeconomic feature. In this paper specifically, we basically looked at kind of to what extent the governmental securitized discourse transfers to different groups across the society. And we, for instance, found that ethnic minorities or linguistic minorities also have more positive view of China. So basically, they don't follow kind of the governmental negativity towards China. That especially applies to the US, where you would think, based on the official American policy towards China, that American public should be the most negative, but that's actually not the case. Big groups of American society do not have negative image of China. And this chart is also from Pew Research, and it also kind of explains this socioeconomic importance. And basically, this chart shows that that countries with which are less developed would tend to have more positive view of China. And in a way, what I'm saying is that that this rule does not only apply to the country level, but it also applies within the country level. So, for instance, as I said, the ethnic minorities in developed countries such as the US or Western Europe would have more positive view of China, because in a way they would have their own problems with their own government, and so they would not jump on board of the government policy towards China. I'm going to show you maybe last few more charts. I know I'm going a little fast, but I hope you can at least get a bit of taste, and then we can focus a bit more in the discussion. But here you're looking at the regression analysis from our last year's survey in Central European countries, so the Visegrad 4 countries. And in a way, you see that that age actually doesn't, in a way, the older people in the Central Europe tend to have more positive image of China. So that's a difference from most of the rest of the world. And again, my explanation for this would be, and the data seems to back it up, that older people would be more traditional. They would often be more in favor of even the communist past. They would tend to be more in favor of Russia. They would be less pro-Western, and that would make them slightly also more positive about China. But also the impact of age is quite small here. You see that with the education is exactly opposite. So basically, the more educated people in Central Europe have worse image of China, which is interesting because in the Western Europe, it's exactly opposite. The more educated people would have more positive image of China, because more educated people will tend to be more liberal, and more liberal people in the West would tend to be more positive about most foreign countries, and they would treat China as just another foreign country, but not us in Central Europe, where we still feel a bit insecure about where we strategically belong. And so basically people would be choosing between West and East. But also here what is interesting, which again goes to our discussion or focus on the generation divide, that users of Telegram, of TikTok, of YouTube tend to be more positive about China, right? And that, of course, tells us kind of quite a bit about what drives this generation divide in these countries. I also added here the similar regression about Taiwan, maybe so you can compare this. And With Taiwan, you see especially that the education is exactly opposite. That more educated people will have more positive image of Taiwan, right? So I think that makes sense here. And I think this is my last slide, and so I will leave you with this slide, and I'll be looking forward to discussion. So I added here some a screenshot from our findings in a survey in Serbia, which was the only Southeast Asian country we surveyed. We also surveyed Greece, though. But in Serbia, this was from 2020. So, of course, some of the political parties evolved and so on. But you kind of see that basically Serbians in general tend to have very positive image of China, and that even applies to sort of the opposition, although you see the difference that the opposition will be somewhat less positive on China. And then you also see this sort of West versus East identity divide, where people who consider themselves, so Serbians who consider themselves part of the global West, would tend to be somewhat less positive about China, while the Serbians who will consider themselves to be member of the East will be more positive on China. A similar kind of divide you will see about how the Serbians would kind of remember the communist or perceived communist past, right? So those who would have more positive view will have more positive view of China and vice versa. So I think that's it from me for now. I hope I was not too quick, that you got maybe a bit of sense. I realize I did not talk entirely about the age, but I felt that it's good to contextualize how age fits with other driving forces. And we should also admit that as much as we talk about the generation divide, this divide is not the biggest divide. So we should also not over exaggerate this, even though it exists. So looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this overview. It helps really a lot put things in context. But let's zoom on that. With all the caveats, right? So it's not that Gen Z, the main takeaway, not that Gen Z is generally positive about China, but it's more positive than older generations. And it's not that age is the main factor, but it is one of the factors that predict some kind of difference. So with that taken into account, can you just synthesize what is then, aside from all these other factors, if we just focus on age, what is the main, let's say, contribution of age in the formation of perceptions on China? Or how does you already mentioned some things, but if you can just zoom in on that. Why do we see that difference in young people in general? And you can also, because you have data worldwide, you can also, let's say, compare different parts of Europe, different parts of the world.
Yeah. So first of all, about the description. So I think in most of the world, young people will tend to be more positive about China, but that's not everywhere. Right? So I've mentioned it doesn't apply to South Korea, it doesn't apply to Hungary and Central Europe. I suspect it may not apply to Southeast Asia. Southeast Europe as well, right? That maybe, for instance, in Serbia, as our data would show, young people will tend to be more liberal, more pro-Western, and that will make them less positive about China. So this is something we should kind of always keep in mind when we talk about public opinion, that there are different driving forces. And so we started also this talk about, with the video, there is the social media trend about China maxing and so on. But it's interesting that this sort of, we didn't talk much, Anastas, about the China maxing, but maybe people here are familiar. I'm not so big on social media, so I'm trying to reproduce kind of what mainly I read, not so much what I saw. But basically in recent month, maybe about a year or two, increasingly there are Chinese cultural products which are somehow becoming very appealing. So of course, maybe one of the first was Labubu, but also maybe the gaming community likes Chinese computer games. And then there was, I would say, especially over the previous 1 year, there was this trend about the China maxing, and people on social media were talking, of course, young people were talking about, how they are at the Chinese period of their life, and they were like drinking hot water and like doing Tai Chi in park, and basically kind of half jokingly saying, copying the Chinese trends. And I think that has a lot to do with being frustrated with the West, especially, the Donald Trump kind of thing and so on. And, part of that was also driven even before by, TikTok being blocked in the US. A lot of TikTokers even migrated to, the Chinese Xiaohongshu social media, which in a way became interesting because that is one social media now where both Chinese and global audiences interact perhaps the most. Because obviously, in terms of social media ecosystems, in China, you have most Western social media blocked, and vice versa. Most Westerners do not go on other Chinese social media. So you would have Xiaohongshu as one platform where you would have perhaps the most interaction. So I guess what I'm saying is that young people, Gen Z in the US, maybe in Western Europe, who are also frustrated with America, not being the defender of liberal democracy. These kind of people suddenly, realize, so to say, that China is not as bad, even though American governments have tried to portray, in a way, they kind of shift from one extreme to the other extreme. And what I'm saying is that this doesn't apply to countries like Hungary, for instance, because of course young people in Hungary were more frustrated with their leaders rather than with the US, right? So in a way that was more immediate frustration for them, and kind of this attitude towards their leaders in Hungary led them exactly in the opposite direction. And for instance, in Czech Republic, we would also see the difference, right? Because the young people will also, as I said, will be more pro-Western, and they would not see China as something as a role model. So I hope that makes some sense. So there are these different directions. So even though young people in Hungary and Czech Republic may still be exposed to China maxing on social media and this is the same content, but the context, their living context, is not the same, because of course they live in Czech Republic, in Hungary, or in Serbia, which will put that in a different.
And another takeaway from this point is that a lot of the opinions about China are not only about China, but they're in a context of a global constellation, right? So you suggest there is association of China. So in Hungary, if young people are anti-government and the government is close to China, they immediately see China is guilty by association with their domestic government. Okay, so now let's shift on the opinion-making side. So we know about the perceptions, we understood the perceptions. What is the input of and here we enter more of analysis for maybe China foreign policy or global politics or whatever. But what is the, let's say, what are the measures that China is taking of maybe tapping into the potential of getting more attraction, not soft power, but being more attractive in the eyes of in general Western audiences, and then maybe zoom in on Gen Z as well.
Yeah. I'm kind of laughing because for a few years, also when I had these discussions with Chinese colleagues, one of the common question, the Chinese colleagues would ask me is, what can China do to improve its image in Europe? And, my half joking answer was, try not to do anything, right? Try not to be in the news, because if China is in the news in Europe, it means it's something bad. And, so Anastas, you're asking me what is China doing well in recent 1-2 years? China's doing very well keeping quiet. and waiting for Trump to destroy the image of the US and so on. And China, is like never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. So China doesn't do much on Venezuela, doesn't do much on Iran. It's, you open BBC, it's full of what's happening in the US or what the US is doing. And much of that is negative. And so, and basically what is happening is that the image of China, but even image of Russia, as you saw in the public opinion survey, they are slowly improving. They are not positive in Europe. They are still negative, but they are kind of becoming almost neutral. Why? Well, because, as I showed, and that's why I also showed you the charts, Europeans had negative image of China because of political values, because of China's foreign policy. But basically now, with what kind of news are coming from the US, the perception of normality, perception of the context change. And suddenly the fact that China, I don't know, the Europeans, of course, a lot of Europeans are negative about the Chinese attitude towards Taiwan, threatening invasion, South China Sea and so on. But now the US is threatening invasion of Greenland and conducting invasion and wars, right? So I'm not saying that those are the same things, but I'm saying that somehow invasion has become normal, so to say, in the news. Similarly, when we talked about 2017, 18, 19 and so on, why Europe's image of China turned very negative, we said that's because Chinese political system turned more authoritarian, right? We had Xinjiang situation, the news were full of camps in Xinjiang and re-education, and then of course Hong Kong protest, very negative, right? And so those were type of the news which you heard from China. Of course, then the COVID, or spread from China and so on. But now, people don't read about China. These sort of domestic political values. When did you last read about Xinjiang, about Hong Kong, right? Now you read about problems in the US, right? Here someone gets shot, then something happens. And so again, this kind of political values driving force somehow becomes weaker with China because the context, the perception of normality, which is shaped to a large extent by Trump, changes. So then what you see is that the huge frustration with the US, and not only that China's image gets relatively better, it also gets absolutely better because it's out of the news.
And if I may add something, I think China has been also doing some small moves that kind of help in this direction, especially in contrast to the US. So on one hand, you see, for instance, the Trump administration totally cracking down on migration visas, like freezing visas for half the world and so on and so on. And then China introducing visa-free travel, for instance, and then inviting influencers. This is not something that's on a grand scale, but incrementally, I think, helps, at least within those circles that are into China maxing and zooming in on Chinese culture. I think it helps. Well, good. Thank you very much, Richard. I want to open the floor now because we have quite some distinguished audience here. Maybe some people would like to take the floor, ask a question, give a comment.
Hi, I have a question. Sorry that something wrong with my camera, so I cannot turn it on. Yeah, the first question is that regarding your service, I want to know, do your service distinguish between attitudes toward China as a political actor versus China as a society and culture? I ask because as a Chinese student here in Europe, I often find that some people separate the two quite sharply, and that distinction might explain some of the findings in your data. And the second is about, does your data set also include whether respondents have ever visited China or had a direct personal contact with Chinese people? Given that contact theory also predicts these should significantly moderate attitudes and its absence from the regression you showed, I don't know whether it exists in your actual survey, but from this lecture, I didn't see that. So that's one of my questions. And also, I'm curious that does your sample include Chinese, like the immigrants or Chinese international students living in these European countries? And if so, do the attitudes differ meaningfully from the broader local population? And also, as some interesting points, you ever talked like the Xiaohongshu, especially at the beginning of last year about like the TikTok refuge, especially from the US, they rush into Xiaohongshu in China, and I think it's kind of the communication completely without any political values, but only like the people living in the global Earth, and they talk and they share each other. Seems like a very open communication with each other. And then I found that some discrimination, also the stereotype, has been broken up through this kind of like the social media communication. So I think that's an interesting point. And also, you mentioned that people do not talk like about the Xinjiang or something very sensitive political way, because to some of Chinese, because that's why I ask whether you included like the respondents, whether they have visited to China, because once I think they get in touch with the real China, other than they just get the information from the media, especially like the media also with like the political control or something like that, which is about like the reality of the information. So yeah, that's it. That's all my question and the things I want to share.
Great, great. Now, these are great questions. And actually, the short answer is yes, we have included pretty much all of what you mentioned. And actually, we also published already some of that. So, where to start? We published recently, I published an article about how the global Chinese diaspora perceive China. And that's very interesting because all in all, the Chinese diaspora tends to be more positive on China than kind of non-Chinese people internationally. But also the Chinese diaspora differs a lot. And so what we found is that the Chinese diaspora that speaks Mandarin Chinese is more positive, but the diaspora which speaks other, so Cantonese or other Chinese dialects, they would not be as positive. Or for instance, there is Chinese diaspora which doesn't speak Chinese, right? They recognize themselves as Chinese, but they would speak other languages. And so also they would not be that positive. So that's kind of on the diaspora question. The perception about China, Chinese culture. So this is exactly where our survey adds a lot of granularity because we have all these questions. And we also published another article about kind of how perception of Chinese people differs from perception of China. I mean, there's a whole article, like 30 pages, but I guess, short answer would be that indeed a lot of Europeans will differ between China as a political state, which will tend to have more negative image than the Chinese people. But then that difference would also depend on the political values. So, for instance, the liberal Europeans will make a bigger difference than the conservative Europeans, and so on. And I wanted to say one more thing which you mentioned, but I forgot now. So. Yeah, no, but in general, I'm also happy to, if you're interested in these topics, you can approach me and I'm happy to share you these publications. So these were good questions.
I wonder you can send the things to me after this and I can forward to the group. Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Jing, for the questions. I think Nemanja had his hand raised.
Yeah. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I mean, you showed a lot of data, so it was really interesting. I come from Montenegro, so my question would be, I guess, more closer to your case. You show Serbia, which is our closest case in the region of country with a positive attitude towards China. So I was part of this question you answered with saying basically that China did nothing. The West decided to destroy their own image in Eastern Europe, for instance. But it seems to me that like a Serbia is a very interesting case, especially when compared to South Korea, because in Serbia you have a strong anti-communist narrative, but you also have strong anti-Western narrative. But it seems that the hatred for the West and for America especially somehow overrides the anti-communist narrative, which allows China to have a pretty good penetration into like soft power, you know. And my question with regards to that is like China did make, I would say, one mistake in Europe, and that's supporting Russia in Ukrainian war. I mean, most liberal Europeans would say that's a mistake, an active hostile action in Europe. So, do you have data on how opinion on China shifted with respect to Ukrainian war and perception of China supporting not only China, it was also North Korea with some soldiers there and et cetera, et cetera. But like it seems to me that Ukraine holds a special place among those young people who maintain negative attitudes towards China. Do you have data on that? And also, is your data available publicly?
The data is not fully available. We are kind of progressively publishing parts of the data, trackers, and so on. So again, you can either follow those links which I shared, or you can get in touch with me and tell me what you're interested in. We are in the process of publishing the whole data set, but haven't done it yet. On the Russia-Ukraine war, my usual answer to this is that data doesn't show that the war had such a major impact on the China's image. And that's primarily because China's image was so bad before the war. It didn't have a space where to fall. You know what I mean? I mean, you had, I don't know, 20% Europe, 80% Europeans being negative on. I mean, keep in mind that just before the Russian invasion, there was the COVID, which, impacted China's image. And before that, there was Hong Kong, there was Xinjiang, there was, Taiwan became more in the news. So there was really not much space to fall unless China itself commits an invasion, such as Russia did, right? But that didn't happen. And also, I think I of course agree with you that for many people, China again is guilty by association with Russia, but China still, and many actually, Russia is not happy with the type of support it gets from China. So China, as much as we criticize China, we should also say that China tries somehow to balance it. And China, for instance, when I'm engaged in EU-China think tank dialogues, for instance, it's not that the Chinese try to argue so much with you; they try to avoid the topic, and they are pretty good at avoiding topics they don't want to talk. So you criticize them, help us with Russia, don't do this, and then they say, why don't we talk about something else? Right? And they persistently tries to avoid those topics. And, as we also heard, effectively, they try to divert discussion from politics, even from economic frictions into other things. Right? And they, in a way, the China maxing, social media trends, and so on, this is filling the media information space with the type of information which puts China in a better light. So I didn't want to, I kind of exaggerated a little bit when I said that China just do nothing and, that improves the image of China. Of course, China does something. But if I should put the main reason why China's image in Europe is kind of slightly improving is not that China does something very proactively, but as you correctly pointed out, of course in Serbia situation is a bit different, in Pakistan situation is a bit different. But Serbia and Pakistan already have positive image of China. So over there, if China starts doing something, it is meeting audience, which is already kind of friendly. If China comes to the Czech Republic and starts doing something, everyone just starts responding like, okay, what about Xinjiang? What about the communism? What about this? So in a way, there are different strategies and tactics which could work in a different context, depending on, where the image is already. Thanks for the question.
Do we have any final questions? If not, I would use my position here to ask, okay, so we talk about perceptions, small actions. Anyway, back to the big geopolitical questions. How do perceptions translate into geopolitical currency? So how do they affect? Do they matter geopolitically, and to what extent? And if we conditionally say that the image of China is slightly improving, or at least compared to the US now is slightly better, what kind of potential geopolitical impacts it may have on the short to medium term? Now I put you in the era of, not in the era, in the territory of speculation. So please feel free to open up and even.
No, fair enough. See, usually I answer these type of questions with two points. First point is that, of course, there is some link between public and policies, right? In democracies, but even in authoritarian regimes, right? Even dictators somehow cannot oppose their people because, they are worried about rebellion, whatever, right? Of course, in democracies, people vote, they can vote the leaders out. But let's be frank, China is usually not the reason why, China was not the reason why Hungarians voted Orban out. Might have contributed, but it was not the reason. So the reason why I study public opinion and why I think it's very useful is that understanding public attitudes tell you something about the vibe, right? That's why a lot of the public opinion surveys are called barometers, right? So you kind of know that Greeks have different perceptions from the Germans, and at the end of the day, your leaders are also part of your epistemic community in the country. And so, when you learn something about Spanish public opinion, you can have a guess that the Spanish leadership may follow similar structure of driving forces and so on and so on. So this is why I study public opinion. And often, these trends in public opinion tells you how the foreign policy can evolve, right? So yeah, this would be my answer that, seeing, for instance, now the big question is not so much or the big finding is not so much that the China's image is getting slightly more positive, in Europe. The big takeaway should be that the US is perceived more negatively, and it's just about, it's under China. And so talking about the EU, global foreign policy, this tells you about, where we are and what we can expect.
Thank you very much, Richard. If there is anyone else who wants to jump in, please feel free. If not, I think we can slowly wrap up.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for the questions, comments. Happy to be here. Thanks, Anastas, again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And see you in 2 weeks for our next seminar. Thank you, Richard.
Have a good day.